Calling to order this hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. I am Phil Mendelson, Chair of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Thursday, January 18th, 2024. The time is 11:13 in the morning, and this hearing is being held, I think, live in room 412 of the Johnny Wilson Building. Yes, I'm in 412, and I am alive. We have one witness who may be participating virtually. I don't think she's here, Stephanie McGill. If she shows up virtually, then this is a hybrid hearing. Otherwise, this is an in-person hearing. The subject of this hearing is Bill 25-356, entitled the Floodplain Review Authority Amendment Act of 2023. This legislation was introduced at the request of the mayor on June 29th of last year, 2023. The stated purpose of this legislation is to clarify the law to ensure that the Department of Energy and Environment retains authority under the Applications Insurance Implementation Act, which was a law adopted by the council. It's DC Law 1-64. That DOEE retains authority to implement regulations relating to flood hazards and safety in the district. This, in turn, enables the district to maintain and thus obtain the benefits of its membership in the National Flood Insurance Program. This legislation was first adopted on an emergency basis, meaning that it is already in effect this past fall, but that legislation will expire. There was an emergency and temporary bill. And so this permanent legislation is necessary, and under council rules, a hearing is required on all bills before they can be considered by the full council. The record in this matter will close at 5 p.m. on Thursday, February 1st, 2024. That is to say 2 weeks from now at 5 p.m. So let me double check. Stephanie McGill, not here. So Nicholas Bernard, that leaves you. Come on forward. You don't look very excited. I hope that you're excited when you testify. Well, we're very mean. I may jump over the dais, but maybe not, because I don't like injuring myself. Why don't you proceed with your statement?
Sure. Good morning, Chairperson Mendelson, members of the committee and staff. My name is Nicholas Bernard, the Chief of the Water Resources Protection and Mitigation Branch in the Regulatory Review Division of the Department of Energy and Environment, commonly referred to as DOEE. The pronouns I use are he and him. I'm here today to present testimony on behalf of Mayor Muriel Bowser and DOE Director Richard Jackson in support of Bill 25-356, the Floodplain Review Authority Amendment Act of 2023. This legislation would restore DOE's longstanding floodplain authority so that DOE can continue to protect residents and businesses from flood hazards arising from floodplain development and secure critical benefits for the district with membership in the National Flood Insurance Program. The district's law on flood hazards was enacted as the District of Columbia Applications Insurance Implementation Act in 1976. DOE is funded and staffed to administer and perform the functions of this act. Since 1998, the mayor delegated the functions of this act to DOE and its predecessor agencies through mayor's orders. However, the Department of Buildings Establishment Act of 2020 inadvertently cast doubt on the delegation to DOE by requiring the mayor to delegate the functions in the Applications Insurance Implementation Act to the director of the Department of Buildings. The Department of Buildings supports the Floodplain Review Authority Amendment Act of 2023 so that DOE can continue to be delegated the responsibility for administering the Applications Insurance Implementation Act, since DOE has the technical expertise and staff capacity to perform flood hazard review under the Act. DOE has promulgated and enforced regulations to ensure floodplain development is done safely, ensuring buildings are constructed in a way that minimizes risk to occupants and mitigating damages to homes, buildings, and properties when a flood occurs. DOE's flood hazard reviews are also necessary for the district to maintain membership in the National Flood Insurance Program, abbreviated NFIP, established by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. To be a member of the NFIP, communities must appoint an agency or official who is responsible for fulfilling all the membership requirements of the NFIP, which include annual community outreach, development and review of floodplain maps, and adopting and enforcing floodplain management regulations to regulate development in flood hazard areas. The mayor designated DOEE to perform these functions, which it has done for more than 25 years. As a member of the NFIP, the district is eligible for crucial benefits, including guaranteed annual grants to support floodplain management, access to affordable flood insurance for district residents through the NFIP, and federal disaster relief should a flood occur in the district. If the legislation is not passed, identical temporary legislation enacted as L 2585 that is currently in effect would expire on July 13th, 2024. Plans for the construction of new and redeveloped buildings in flood hazard areas in the district, such as areas around Watts Branch, Oxen Run, Buzzard Point, and Poplar Point, would no longer be reviewed for flood resilience. Without flood resilience reviews, buildings may be constructed below the expected flood heights, and should a flood occur, it would endanger the occupants and result in far greater damage to property than would have otherwise occurred. Recovery efforts after future floods could be lengthier and more costly for both district government and its residents. Currently, 93% of all residential buildings in the 100-year floodplain are in Ward 7 and 8, communities that can least afford any required repairs. Furthermore, the district's continued participation in the NFIP may be jeopardized. If the district is suspended from the NFIP, most forms of federal government disaster assistance for flood damages would be unavailable during a presidentially declared disaster, and most forms of federal grants and loans would not be available within the identified flood hazard areas. District residents and businesses would pay higher flood insurance premiums and may ultimately be prohibited from renewing flood insurance policies or purchasing new policies. DOE looks forward to working with the council as it moves forward with this legislation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bernard. Give me just a second here. Mr. Bernard, since there was one non-government witness who signed up to testify who did not show up, and that's it. Do you know if there's any opposition to this legislation?
None that I know of.
And the sole effect of this legislation is simply to shift back to DOEE the authority to review plans.
That's correct.
So it doesn't in any way affect additional requirements for permit applicants.
That's correct.
How efficient is the plan review? And what I mean by that is that I hear complaints that when folks file for a building permit, that it sometimes takes a long time. That's the Department of Buildings. Here, we're talking about two agencies. If this goes back to Department of DOEE, does that just cause further delays? How efficient is this process, is the plan review process?
Well, we like to think it's pretty efficient. You're right, it does involve two agencies, and this is typical not just of floodplain management, but things like stormwater review, well permit review. So what happens is an applicant applies to the Department of Buildings for a building permit, and that permit is flagged either based on the location or the type of work that's being done. And if it affects an environmental resource, such as floodplain management, DOB will flag it for us and it'll come to us for review. And once we approve it, it goes back to DOB, and then DOB can continue working on their own review.
Are those time-consuming reviews by DOEE? Let's say floodplain?
It depends on the type of construction that's being done. Some of them are very quick, and in some cases, we turn them around in a day or two. In other cases, there are large buildings that have to have more complex flood proofing done, and it has more complex review.
I'm thinking of Washington Harbor, which has gates, if I remember correctly. So that would be a more complicated and time-consuming review.
That's right.
And if I was building a house, much less time.
Well, one thing that helps to reduce the amount of time is if we get plans that are well done and without any errors. And if that's the case, it can be a very quick review within a couple of days.
So this bill would repeal section 6B, I think it is. This was something that was added by legislation the council adopted in 2020, late 2020. This is 6B solely related to this review authority? I should have looked at it before I came here, but I didn't. In other words, are we touching anything more than just the, by repealing section 6B, are we touching anything more than just who reviews these plans?
Well, it's a little bit more than, I mean, review is primarily the thing, but there's also other functions that the Insurance Implementation Act sort of allows whoever is delegated that authority to be sort of the link between FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program and the district. And as I mentioned in my testimony, there are requirements that the district has to do in order to maintain that membership, including community outreach and floodplain mapping. So by giving that back to DOE allows DOE to do all those things, which we have been doing going forward.
So the 2020 Act, affected these other aspects of what DOE does, like the public outreach.
It didn't affect the thing it affects is which district agency is responsible for coordinating with FEMA on the National Flood Insurance Program and which agency is responsible for reviewing floodplain plans.
Do you have any sense of why the council did this in 2020? Was this just inadvertent or was there something intentional? Were there conversations that had occurred?
Well, I don't want to speculate, but there were no conversations that occurred. So, yeah, prefer not to speculate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lastly, I kind of just want to talk more generally about where there are floodplains in the district. So I'm aware that we have problems around the memorials, Jefferson Memorial. Of course, that's all federal, but I do know that there are concerns about flooding. I want to say 100-year flood. These things seem to happen more frequently now, but a flood that could inundate more of the mall. I'm aware of flooding that occurs in the area of Rhode Island Avenue. I want to say around 6th Street, maybe 6th or 8th Street. That there's been flooding historically in the area around Bloomingdale, but that seems to have been mitigated somewhat by the storm sewer fixes. And I know maybe from your testimony as well as elsewhere that there's flooding in Ward 7 and 8, although that's a little confusing to me. I mean, I've seen Watts Branch. Watts Branch is, I can't imagine it flooding, but, so can you say more about where there are floodplains in Ward 7 and 8?
Sure. Yeah, I think in the case of Watts Branch, which is Ward 7, and Oxen Run, which is Ward 8, those are smaller streams, right? Much less volume than we see on the Potomac and Anacostia. But those are in FEMA floodplain maps, designated as, in the 100-year flood zone. And the reason they're there is because if there's heavy rain in the watershed, so meaning, there's areas that drain towards Oxen Run. That's why it's a stream. But if there's too much rain, then that stream can hold. It starts to go over the banks, and that's what happens, occasionally for both those communities in Watts Branch and Oxen Run.
They do both overflow their banks from time to time?
Yes.
They're both within parkland, which I assume is much of the valley, so to speak. But development, they're still outside the park, development in the floodplain.
That's right. Um, yeah, in both cases, there is parkland sort of directly adjacent to West Branch and Oxen Run, but there are also, even with that parkland, the floodplain extends beyond that and does, intersect a number of buildings.
Besides those two streams, other areas of the district where there's flooding or floodplain?
Yes, so there's, it'd probably be easier to show you a floodplain map, but in general, so Wasp Branch, Oxen Run are two floodplain areas. And then there's also sort of a crescent shape that goes, around from 17th Street and Constitution that covers Federal Triangle and then sweeps down into Southwest DC. And, pretty much goes to, close to, that covers Fort McNair and then areas above that too. And I'll just note that those floodplain areas that I'm talking about, those are what we call coastal and riverine floodplain areas. So this is when water comes over the banks of a river or a stream. And that's what FEMA can map. And this is consistent with how FEMA does it in pretty much every municipality. What we're finding and what I think most cities, especially on the East Coast, are finding is that there are areas of flood risk that exist outside what FEMA maps. And those areas are what we call interior flooding areas. So areas like Bloomingdale that you mentioned and the Rhode Island Avenue area. These areas don't flood because they are close to a stream or a creek. In fact, when they flood, sometimes the rivers are completely normal elevation. The reason they flood is because there's too much rain that overwhelms the stormwater system in those areas, and the water in the stormwater system backs up in ponds on the streets and sometimes in homes. So there are a few areas of the districts that are not mapped in the FEMA floodplain map, but obviously do have flood risk. And DOE is actually working on a what we call the integrated flood model right now to help us map those areas that are that exist outside the FEMA floodplain maps.
And those areas are flagged at DOB, Department of Buildings, for your review?
It's a good question. They are not. Our existing floodplain regulations define the regulated area to be exactly what FEMA says the 100-year floodplain is.
Should the council revisit that? Are there implications, but just kind of more abstractly, should the council revisit that?
Well, the council did enact legislation. It was the Flood Resilience Act. I can't remember the year, which did provide the mayor authority to create new flood hazard areas, outside the FEMA flood hazard areas. So the council has provided that authority to the mayor.
Okay. So the National Mall, 17th Street, that would be all part of the coastal flooding. Oxen Run and Watts Branch, would that be coastal flooding, or that would be, what's that called?
Yeah, we would call that riverine flooding because it's it's related to a water course. But interestingly enough, there are areas in the West Branch neighborhood that also are vulnerable to interior flooding. So regardless of the water elevation in the Watts Branch. But the areas in the FEMA floodplain map in Watts Branch, when you look at those, I would say those are riverine flooding areas.
I hear complaints from residents east of the river about the underpasses under Kenilworth and 295. You look like you're aware of what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Is
yeah.
that the DC water issue, meaning water and sewer? or some other issue, how should the city, can the city mediate that and how?
Yeah, this is unfortunately a complicated issue. There's, so the area that I'm familiar with is the underpass, the Nanny Helen Burrows underpass under 295, which we are aware, does flood frequently. Um, and it's complicated because it's very close to Lost Branch itself, so it's vulnerable to water coming over the banks, but also the stormwater infrastructure here and also the topography. The surrounding topography sort of funnels water towards that area as a low point. And so all of those factors combined, the topography, the storm sewer system, and the proximity to Lost Branch, make it a complicated situation that we need to work with DC Water and other agencies to figure out a path forward.
Give me a second. I don't have any other questions for you. If there's anything that you think of that would be helpful, please submit it. Usually I get no takers on that, but I'm inviting you to if you want, and I will repeat for the record that the record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. We'll close at 5 PM on Thursday, February 1st. And we'll look to see if we can mark this up fairly quickly. I think I'll leave it at that. So I'm going to end this hearing. We have a second hearing and it was scheduled for 12 o'clock or immediately following this, but that would be immediately following this hearing if this hearing went beyond 12. So I'm going to adjourn this hearing and then at 12 o'clock I'll convene the next hearing. Thank you, Mr. Bernard. I hope the experience wasn't too bad.
Thank you, Chairman Matheson.
Thank you. The time is 11:35 and this hearing is adjourned.